To order, I can't yell, so I'm just going to bang when I need to. I'm going to call the meeting to. So good evening, everyone. We'll call the meeting to order at 6:01. We'll warn you in advance that we are attempting to go paperless, and so you are my guinea pigs and I'm your guinea pig tonight, and we're going to be trying to do it this way. So if we stumble, that's why. Before we get started, of course, I want to recognize that we are on the unceded traditional territory of the Sunaymo people, and that is particularly poignant today of the days that shortly follow Orange Shirt Day, which is a very meaningful way to kind of honor the horrors that many experienced in the residential schools. So for those of us who have family members that have been touched by that or are aware of that, I just wanted to acknowledge that that was just a couple of days ago. Welcome, Tanya. You are right, effectively on time within a minute. That's on time in island time. Okay, I'll see if there's any additions, deletions to the agenda. Seeing none, any suggestions of change in order? Seeing none, we will move on. I will ask for an approval for the agenda. Moved by Trustee O'Neill, seconded by Trustee Wilkinson. All those in favor? Unanimous. And we're looking at the approval of the minutes of September 4th, 2019. Seek a motion to approve. Trustee McKay, and seconded by Trustee Higginson. Excuse me. Okay. Sorry. Oh, yes. All those in favor for adopting the minutes? That looked unanimous. I see no presentations on our agenda. I will move or look at Trustee Higginson then for an update on reconciliation, if there is any.
My computer making noise. With the committee met, and we are devising our next steps, trying to work together with the Nats-Matapalat Committee on how this framework would be woven through the schools and the operations. Still some work to do on that. So not much else to report, but I think one of the things I was going to mention tonight is that this became a standing item when the committee was an ad hoc committee of the board, and it's no longer an ad hoc committee of the board. So I don't know if we need to continue having an update on it on our agendas. We've hired someone to be full-time, do the work. It's we're no longer sort of overseeing that. So I just put that out there to folks to consider, and I will leave that in the hands of the agenda setting committee to decide next month. But
We can talk about that, the agenda setting committee. Wondering if there's any opinions that people wanted to express at this moment in time while we're all here. No? Okay, so we will have a conversation about that. Thank you, Trustee Higginson. Okay, moving on to senior staff reports. Well, this is where it gets challenging. I don't know who's doing the presentations.
Deputy Superintendent Davey, Assistant Superintendent.
Great. Okay. So that's right. Okay. So Deputy Superintendent Davey and Assistant Superintendent Tate and Assistant Superintendent Balcombe will be doing a presentation on our startup this year. That's not on this.
Thank you, everyone, and through the chair. What we would like to do today is we are going to be presenting on 3 topics that tie into startup. The first one is I'm going to be going through a timeline. You have an information sheet in front of you. I apologize in advance. On the front of it says closed board education meeting, and it's actually just for the education committee, and it's not a confidential sheet. So if you ignore that portion of it, everything's going to be fine moving forward. So that sheet, I will be taking a few minutes to walk you through that sheet, and really what it ties into is the question around why are we not in our full class organization at the elementary school at the start of the year, and I'll hopefully be able to explain to you how the process works and the timeline that we follow on that. Assistant Superintendent Tate is going to be walking through for you and giving you a picture or a taste of the activities that take place during the first week or into the second week in the elementary schools, and the kind of things that happen to get schools ready, get students ready for classes before we go into our tentative org placements for our schools. And I say tentative because we have a September 30th date that we're looking at for us to be able to demonstrate best efforts for class size and composition. So I'll be speaking a little bit to that as well. And Assistant Superintendent Belcombe will be speaking to you about a proposal that we have going forward. We did meet with the chair and the vice chair of the Education Committee, and for a format that we'd like to see moving forward, so we'll just be outlining that in further detail. So, anything else to add? No? Okay, good. So if you wouldn't mind, if you could turn to the sheet, and again, my apologies, it is 6 pages. Hearing that we are going paperless, I apologize for that, but I think it is actually important information for you to have. So when you're out there having conversations, questions are being asked of you as trustees or members of the Education Committee, you'll have a better understanding of the process and what we go through as a district and as staff through getting ourselves ready for school startup. So we've entitled it School Startup 101, and I'm going to give you a background here then. Each school year, preparations for school startup begin at the conclusion of 1701 data submission to the Ministry of Education. Now that's an important deadline or date for us. We work through September. Our staff and through the finance department, we're working to have the submission to the ministry for our final numbers with the September count, and those are then submitted to the ministry. Right after that, we're into the start of preparations for next year. So I want to point that out. We're looking at the third week in October, or the end of October, we're starting preparations for startup for next year. So if people are asking, why have you left it so long, or people are indicating that we as a district aren't prepared, in actuality, we're starting almost a year in advance to get ready for the coming school year. Within that, then, I'd like to point out that the work is taking place. It's interdepartmental work. So Department of Learning Services, the Facilities Department, the Finance Department really are involved in these processes for school startup, and this doesn't include the staffing processes that we'd be going through with the HR department and all of the work that's taking place there, just to get personnel in place for schools.
I could stop you there. I think we actually
Sure.
have a question from Trustee Kelly.
Yes.
Thank you. Through the chair, just for my benefit,
Yes.
can you please tell me what 1701 data submission is?
Sure. Okay, so 1701 data submission, there's different components to it, but largely what it's looking at is school numbers. So it's what drives our funding from the ministry. So we have September counts, we have a February count, and we have a July count. And so we have submissions that go to the ministry. So again, our finance team is working on these submissions, and really it's allowing us as a district or you as a board to get funded for the work that we do. So it's what drives our operating budgets. Yeah.
One more from Trustee May.
Thank you, and I'm glad through the chair that Trustee Keller sort of broke the ice, but I remind myself it's a 101 crash course, right? So any question's a good question. So 1701 data submission, I just want to be really clear on September 30th. This September 30th coming up is when you're going to do this for...
September 30th that just passed.
Oh, that just passed.
Yeah, just
We
passed.
are in
Yeah.
October, yes.
Yeah.
So close, but
So with
okay.
that, we have a deadline. That's
Yeah.
when our count is concluded for any students that are in our district.
Yeah.
The finance team will work over the next couple of weeks to get the submission ready for the data collection piece and submit that down to the ministry.
Okay.
And I don't have all the details around that, but I do know that that's what's involved in it. I also know at the school level, there's a lot of information that schools are providing to district staff in preparation for that submission.
Okay.
Yeah.
One more quick follow-up. Thank you. So hot on the tail of sort of submitting the true data for
Yes.
what you've gathered after your predictions from October of last year.
Right.
You're now going to be looking at
Right into it.
the next school year?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Good, you're welcome.
And yeah.
We have a couple more, I'm not sure, we'll see how,
Sure.
you might be here for a while. Trustee Elizabeth.
Thank you. Just to follow up, just to be clear, because I realize I might have had it wrong all these years.
Okay.
With the 1701s, it's not just actually a head count, is it? It's also broken down in terms of how many designations, or is it just a head count?
No, sorry, yes, you're correct. So again, through the chair, it's head count, FTE count, looking at designations, other components to this. We have our staffing submissions that go in. Anything else that you can think of?
Indigenous education?
yeah.
all
Okay,
that's
so we
all
are
part of the
breaking
count.
All of that
demographics.
information, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
because that's how the
Yeah,
budget's
and the designations, yes, that's a huge portion of work that we do through September to make sure that the designations are all up to date. And again, that September 30th deadline is important for us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Trustee King.
Thank you. Different view on 1701 to share with the board. Most parents are familiar with those forms because they come home with a very thick package that we all have to fill out every single year for each of your children, and you fill it out and confirm, yes, this is my address, these are the emergency contacts. So there's also sort of that face of it that goes out, like I think Deputy Superintendent Davies speaking to the internal piece, but there's an external piece to that too that's good for us to know.
Thank you. Okay. So again, what I'm pointing out is the collaborative work that's happening within the departments here. And my final point in the background, this is again a year-round process for both elementary and secondary. So before I move into the information piece, I'd like to bring your attention, have you look at page 5. And this is important. So as I'm going through the timeline, I'll be referencing some of these pieces of information in the appendices here. So if you look at Appendix 1, you can see for elementary and secondary, and there's a reason that we chose June 16th. We have a date within our admin procedures of June 15th, and that's for students to register by June 15th to be guaranteed a spot within their school. So we chose June 16th just to point out the number of transactions, and I'll call them transactions, in terms of transfers, so in-district transfers or new students moving into the district that took place between June 16th and September 13th. September 13th was the date that we gave the go-ahead, the final go-ahead to the last bit of elementary schools to go into their tentative orgs, again, between September 13th and September 30th. We have an obligation for best efforts based on the Supreme Court of Canada ruling to be compliant for class size and composition. So we still are monitoring all the way through the month of September. But you can see through this information that we gathered here, 775 transactions in terms of transfers or new students moving into the district. The amount of work that would go into that for our central registration and the impact that that's going to have on schools. If you have a group of students moving into a particular school, it's going to change those class size and composition numbers. So we're constantly monitoring that information as they're coming through. The next Appendix 2 here, again, is the link. You're welcome to go and have a look at it if you're not familiar with it. I just wanted to point out that information that we rely on is an admin procedure 302, school boundaries and catchment areas. So we look at that along with Appendix 3, admin procedure 303, student registration and school choice. So there's a lot of information in there that help guide the work that we do. The final appendix then on page 6, if you look at the back of it, these are guidelines that we use and that our school principals use. We have conversations on a regular basis with the NDTA in terms of best efforts and compliance. And we also start work in terms of our review of our compliance level in October. So we will be engaging in those conversations with the NDTA coming up here. But I provided this for you so you can see the guidelines that are coming out of the class size and composition language that we are required to use. So it's just there again for your information.
Okay, Trustee Harrison has a question.
Yes.
Thank you, through the chair.
You want.
You may be
just to clarify on Appendix 1, the 775 students that were transfers and new students, the transactions that occurred this year. I'm just curious, I'm not sure if you're going to speak to it elsewhere in here, but how does this compare to previous years?
I don't have an exact number from previous years, but I would say it's probably on par, other than the fact that we have increased enrollment. It's the work that we do, right? So again, we go through the same pattern each year, and people would say, why haven't you got it figured out from last year? You're not changing your practices. It's because we're going through the same processes, and again, you can see during that time frame the number of student interactions or transactions that we have in terms of placing students in schools between that period. So I don't have an exact number, but it's the work that we do. Another thing that I'll point out here, and this is important, this came from Melita Nelson, manager for central registration. We do have a time period here, and this ties into what do you call it, MyEd software. So it's through the ministry, but there is a 2-week period in August where the system is down for a year-end rollover and school set up. So no registrations can be entered during that 2-week period or processed, and that's it's just the way it works. But it's the system, and it's what we have to work with. As we get into September, so registrations are online. But as we get into September, there are families that are coming into the office here, and we set them up with computers, and we're helping them or assisting them with registration so we can expedite the process to get through there. So information, going back to page 1, yes.
Just a quick one.
Yes.
The 775 on Appendix 1.
Yes.
Are these transactions all new students or students moving, like does this also include students leaving the district, these transactions?
No, this would be students transferring within district or new students coming in.
So I guess if I would follow up. So if, let's say a family has to move to Vancouver,
Right.
how quickly will we get that information? Do we not find out until September when they don't show up?
Well, that's a portion of it. So they request information from us. So it really is dependent upon when they request records from our district. Yeah. So we don't determine that. They'll determine when they're putting in requests for it. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So as we go through again the table here, and I don't want to take up a lot of time, but there is a lot of information here. Table serves as procedural timeline for the school startup process at the elementary and secondary levels. Again, starting in October, 1701 data submission is down to the ministry. We then take a look, and this ties in with the facilities department and the finance department. We have discussions around space utilization within schools. So we're determining for the next year, based on projected numbers, what we might be looking at in terms of space needs in our schools. Scope work is done, and that could be for flex space. Really, it's helping us to be at ministry standard for space based on next year's numbers. Portables, determining where we might need portables, computer lab conversions, and again, it's high-level projections at this time of the year, but certainly we're starting to look in October at next year. November, December, January, at the secondary school level, school administration prepares course calendars for the following course selection for next year. So they're proofing course descriptors, they're adding new courses and write-ups for next year, reviewing different programs that the school has, and they're working with their staff committees through this process. And then they're inserting any changes that are coming from the ministry level for new graduation requirements and so forth. So they're doing all of that work in November, December, January. And counselors at the same time then are distributing course selection sheets and starting to prepare for that for the coming school year. In December, registration timelines and dates are established, and this is directly out of Admin Procedure 303. So in December, we're putting out information publicly for families with timelines and dates for the public, catchment area school registration, out of catchment requests, out of district requests, academies, registration there, early French immersion, late French immersion. And at the same time, the French immersion principals then are having open house sessions for their schools, and they're promoting the French immersion programs. And so where are we publicizing this? Web pages, newsletters, bulletin boards, strong starts, public places such as aquatic centers, daycares, and preschools. So we're trying to get that information out about registration that's upcoming. January, in the beginning of January, then online registration opens. It is generally the first couple of days after we return from the winter break. For kindergarten, we have it's open until June 15th, and I mentioned that date as well. Early French immersion then is open until January 31st, and it's followed by either a lottery or a lottery in early February. So when we're looking at early French immersion, it's a lottery system that we use there. Late French immersion, students are placed as space permits. Secondary academies, they're open until March 1st for registration or application. And that's either a lottery or a tryout / audition for families, depending on which program it is, which academy. And out of catchment transfers or requests, they are due by March 31st, and they are reviewed after the June 15th date. And I've got a note here that I've mentioned in-person registration can occur at the central registration office, so if families don't have access to a computer, they're not held up because of that, and we support them directly in the building here. February, then we're looking at preliminary projections, and I've got in brackets conservative, are submitted to the Ministry of Education, and there's a reason for that, and we want to have conservative numbers going in so that we're not over projecting, and then we're being underfunded. So as we're working through the budget process with you as a board, our numbers are again conservative, because if we inflated our numbers and we get less money than you've approved through the budget process, we're not in a good position. Right? So conservative numbers, it's about accountability then to the public and how we're using ministry funds. And another note here, preliminary kindergarten figures are based on Beauregard data and principal local knowledge of the school community. So they're having those conversations out there. We're using Beauregard data at the kindergarten level. Everything else is basically rolled over numbers from, let's say, grade 5 to grade 6. We know how many students are in the school. February and March then at the secondary level, they're looking at the course selection submissions. Counselors are meeting with students by grade and discussing required elective programs. Students go online, so they are doing their course selection process online, usually the second week of semester 2. And this data is then used for the start of building timetables at the secondary level. We're collecting data on numbers of students taking each course and determining numbers of sections or blocks, but sections for each course that we're looking at to provide for students in a given school. Best judgments are used by principals and counselors as they're looking at levels for staffing allocation, and staffing allocations aren't received by schools until April, so they're starting the process in March. They get their staffing allocations in April. Timetablers then begin the task of creating school timetables, being mindful of class size and composition requirements while working with the number of blocks that are allocated to their schools. And administration and counselors conduct grade 7 visits to feeder schools for introduction to the school and student course selection process. Get into March, and again we've got 2 weeks spring break in March, but there's work happening then on this process. Allocation of elementary divisions and secondary blocks are determined based on those preliminary projections that I spoke about that are conservative, and preliminary school orgs and timetabling work begins at both elementary and secondary in March. April is the out-of-catchment kindergarten requests. So if you have an out-of-catchment student who has a sibling in a particular school, we like to honor that. We don't want families to have to drop off at 2 different schools or 3 different schools, depending on how many children they have. So we're trying to get those out-of-catchment students who may have a sibling at a out-of-catchment school into the same school. So, and we're also including those students in the school numbers. At the same time, then preliminary org, school org and timetabling work begins. So when I say org, it's just about the organization of the school. That's what we're looking at. So we're looking at staffing sheets and information packages then are based on preliminary projections are issued to the schools. So in April, schools are actually receiving the staffing that they're provided and starting to become more concrete in terms of what the classes are going to look like in your schools. They're having discussions at the staff committee level, their school-based team level, having discussions with individual teachers about placement of students and also what their classes may look like for the coming year. Again, everything at that point is really preliminary, and they are projecting facilities needs as well in April as identified by projected numbers. So if we're looking at an increase and we're looking to add portables, we're starting to have those discussions and that work in a more concrete way through April. April, May, June, and early September. You can see that we've left out the summer months here because our principals, for the most part, are on summer vacation. Ongoing communication to review at the school level between principals and staff committees, school-based teams, individual teachers, I mentioned that. Monitoring elementary org charts, and we're backing them up, so we have backup weekly. And again, this ties into our best efforts work that we're doing in order to show compliance. And renewal of student designations. So Trustee Bursavich was talking about designations. We're working in April to renew those students who are in our schools, and we're working in September for new designations that are coming in. At the secondary level then, through these months, we're meeting with staff committee to review postings, which classes need to be created or which classes need to be collapsed based on the student's choice in terms of what classes they want to take. They're fine-tuning timetables, they're renewing designations, they're meeting with feeder schools, they are doing grade 7 visits to the schools. Principals are visiting feeder schools, they're having conversations with counselors about designated students and supports they need to provide for transition. And they're inviting grade 7 students into their school, particularly those that are anxious, to come and have more personal time to make that transition smoother. April to mid-September, in-catchment registrations are sorted and processed, weekly monitoring of enrollment updates, ongoing communication with principals, and staff committee meetings and updates. So this work is happening on an ongoing basis through our schools at both levels. May, June, August, and September, weekly updates and backups. And again, we're always mindful of the last page that you have there around best efforts, class size and composition language. In June, out-of-catchment requests are reviewed, and these placements are made where space or timetable permits, and this is important. Even though June 15th date comes, and lots of families then who've applied for out-of-catchment are expecting on June 16th that we're going to start phoning them and making that decision to put out-of-catchment students in. If you can see, we have 775 students from the 16th to April 13th. That we have to try and get into their catchment area schools. We can't start bringing students from out of that catchment area into these schools until after we know that we're settled on our numbers there. So that work is taking place this year, and we've actually done the same thing in previous years. We haven't looked at out-of-catchment placements until after the second week of September for the reason that I just said. All of the students that are in catchment, we want to get them into their in-catchment school before we're bringing other students in. Going into July, August, and September, secondary schools, again, they're working through all of these procedures that are in front of you on page 3. And a lot of consultation work is happening there. One thing that's important as we're going through September here, and this is both elementary and secondary, they are determining if students don't show, so we call it the whites of their eyes, but if we have students who haven't shown up in September, we're either making phone calls, we're going to the home, we're doing whatever we can to find out if that student's moved somewhere and they just haven't told us, or if it's transferred to another school that we're not aware of. But we want to have accurate numbers for each school as we're going through. Final page for me here then, page 4. Counselors, and this is at the secondary level. Counselors are coming in the last week of August to do course changes, and they are again looking at the class size and composition language. They're trying to minimize any remedy situation that we might be in to do with that language, and that work continues through the first week of school. So they're doing a lot of work around moving students, switching timetables and so forth to get them into the right classes. In August, principals are communicating to parents and requesting information for any moves over the summer. And in September, we have a daily review of updates and orgs at the elementary level, continuance of timetable issuance and adjustments at the secondary level. I've noted here between September 1st and September 13th, as per the Appendix 1, 107 new registrations or transfers requests at the elementary level between that 2-week period, and 67 new registrants or transfers requests at the secondary level. So there's a lot of work that's even taking place as we're going through the first couple of weeks in September. Daily review and bi-weekly enrollment updates. So we're having our regular meetings here, getting information out, making sure that we're accurate and we're moving forward. We're reviewing the orgs to make sure, again, that we're compliant. And weekly review meetings during weeks 3 and 4. And we just continue the process as we go through the month of September. So it's a crash course in the work that's done at the district level. Again, we talked about startup, we're talking about September 3rd or whatever date we're starting, but you can see it's almost a year's worth of lead up to get to that date.
Got a couple of questions for you.
Sure, thank you.
Trustee McKay.
Thank you. Through the chair to Deputy Superintendent Beatty. When we're looking at the numbers from September 1st to 13th,
Yes.
you might not be able to answer this, but I'll ask anyways. Are most of those numbers of transfers related to family moves or parent preference requests?
None of them would be out of catchment transfers at that time.
Okay.
So it's all transfers within with district or new families that are moving in. Still new
So
families.
people moving around
People
the
moving
region.
around the district, and we just haven't got them into their classes. Another thing that I'll point out here, at the kindergarten level, we have requirements in terms of data identification that we have to have from families and particular information. So we can be held up there when families don't have records such as birth certificates, proof of address, whatever it may be, and we're waiting for documents to come in. We know the families are there. We keep them on a list. We're just waiting for those documents to be finalized and getting them through school so we can get them in classes.
Thank you.
Through the chair, if I could just add, I've done the math, so you don't have to count. It's 107 in elementary, so 107 students since the beginning of September came into the school. And just explain how disruptive that can be, Mr. Davey, to if those students carry a designation.
It can be disruptive either way, if they do or don't carry designation, depending on the class size that we have. So again, when you're looking at the best efforts on the back of your package there, if you're looking at a maximum class size, take an intermediate class of, so if it's a straight intermediate classroom, you have a class size of 29. If it's a split class, you have a maximum class size of 26, and you can have a reduced class size in there. But if you have a student or two that move into a particular grade level and we don't have space for that student, we often look to a neighboring school if it's after the June 15th date. Our attempts are to have students, and this again is in the bid procedure, and it's driven by the board, but our attempt is always to have students attending their catchment area school or their neighborhood school. Sometimes we're looking to a neighboring school for placement, but we cannot exceed the number of 29 or 26 for a split class if it's intermediate. Elementaries, or primary stories even less, as you can see. If it's a designated student coming in and it's going to put us at the more than 2, we have a lot of work to do in terms of showing best efforts around that. So we're looking at reorganizing sometimes in that first 2 weeks, reorganizing entire schools because of a family that might move in during that time period.
Could you please clarify, are there any differences in the process for class placements in the first couple of weeks between French immersion and non-French immersion, or French immersion and non-French immersion programs, and if so, what those might be?
Yes. Again, through the chair, Because it's a lottery system for French immersion and late French immersion, those students are placed in classes as spaces are available. We don't have the same process that we're going through for a French immersion class. We already know back in the lottery date in February, we're filling our French immersion classes. So we already know what the placements are going to be and how many divisions we're allocating to those French immersion schools. That can adjust, and we did have an adjustment this year at one of our French immersion schools. We actually reduced a division because we had families that moved out of the school. They either moved back into English programs or moved out of the district, which allowed us to reduce a division at one of our French immersion schools. So they don't go through the same process that other schools may have to go through.
I'm actually on the list next. I want to share a parent comment with you because an aid to help me understand our obligation to prioritize in-catchment requests. And so it was a parent who made an out-of-catchment request and was, had submitted that request within the deadline and then was frustrated that all these other people that did not meet the deadline were seemingly prioritized over that on-time request. And so I wondered if you could talk about, to the extent to which we have an obligation to ensure that students have a priority if they're in catchment requests, to whatever extent we can.
Sure. So again, through the chair, thank you. What obligation do we have? We do have a June 15th date. What I can say in terms of the catchment placements is, as well as looking at late registrants coming in, we're also looking at space availability. So we're not going to be taking out catchment placements after that date if we don't have space in a particular school. So we're not going to be adding divisions to a school based on out of catchment requests. It just, financially again, it doesn't make sense for us to be adding divisions to schools. So we've determined our staffing based on projected numbers of students who are in catchment. And there are occasions when we know that we have space in the school and we can take out a catchment request in. So what I would say in response to the parent who's brought this complaint forward to you, we're not going to take a student, especially at the elementary level, and be asking to drive across the district to another school and avoiding their in-catchment school because we're bringing somebody who wants to come from out of catchment into that school. So it's a process we're going through. We can see the numbers here. Families move over the course of the summer, and we have to work with in a way that we're supporting those families to be in their in-catchment school. Thank you.
Trustee O'Neill.
Thank you. And I think your last point really sort of solidified for me. You said at the beginning that you thought this document would be helpful. It's really, really helpful. So, and I don't know if it's the first time this has been done, but certainly I appreciate it. And so, I've got a number of questions and comments, and I know I'm only allowed one, so I'll just try to summarize here that, what I'm hearing is every year this is a challenge for us as a district, and I'm going to assume that it's a challenge for other districts as well, and that we try to mitigate in the best ways that we can. And so, again, back to why I think this is such a helpful document to help us sort of share with people who have a sense of frustration, if nothing else. But I guess I wanted to know, which question should I pick?
Sorry,
okay, I'm gonna.
You give your second one to Bill.
Well, I guess I'm wondering if we have looked at some of the best practices. I think that's a silly question because I think that we do that, but I guess I'll throw that out as more as a suggestion to see how we compare to other districts in this process, and if there is sort of some best practice out there. And my question is, why are we conservative on our report to the ministry? And maybe I'm just, not understanding it, but when I think being conservative, I think shoot for the stars, plan for big, and then, pull back if we don't have those numbers, but what you're saying is if we shoot for high numbers, we actually won't have the money for it. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes.
Thanks.
So part A, your question, and go to part A and part B.
Yeah.
Through the chair.
That's kind of new.
So part A, we do review our processes. We take a look at them. So when I say we, again, it's a team effort. There's a lot of communication among staff, and really Secretary Treasurer Bay and I sit on a committee, staff and finance committee. We're looking at facilities representation, finance department representation, learning services representation. So we're having these conversations on a regular basis, and we're going through, we're getting regular updates in terms of enrollment projections and so forth. But at the same time, we're also talking about our practices and what we can be doing differently. So we refine our practices. I think what you'll find also is that there may be collective agreement language that drives some of our practices. Other districts may have different collective agreement language that drives maybe a different process, different dates and that kind of thing, right? So, so we work within the language that we have. We work also within our admin procedures, and we did actually just go through a process of looking at AP 303 last school year. So we would have reported out to you through former Assistant Superintendent Robin Gray would have done a presentation around those changes that were presented through that admin procedure. So part A, that answers that. Part B, if we were to submit shooting for the stars projections, and we came in, let's say, 100 students short of that, you're talking at roughly $1 million or over $1 million in terms of budget. So when you are working as a board and staff are feeding you information, we don't want to be giving you misinformation and then you are going to be over budgeting, and we're not able to deliver on that. And as a board, you're sitting here with $1 million deficit right at the start of the school year. So yeah, you're welcome.
A couple of occasions throughout this, you referred to the no more than 2.
Yes.
Can you explain what that means?
I can. So what we have, and you'll see on page 6, appendix 4, there's language here, and in the beginning portion of it, and this is information again that our principals have and we're using with our central registration department and finance and other departments here, but we look at this very closely. And the no more than 2, what we're talking about here is our obligation really around the Supreme Court of Canada ruling, the language that's in place for our LOU. And you'll see under the yellow portion here, remedy will be paid to teachers that have students that meet the criteria to be considered in the no more than 2 language. What we're looking at is if you have students in your school with designations, it's our obligation then to try and move those students or place those students in classes so that we don't have more than 2 designations in a particular class. If we do, we're in a situation where we are offering remedy to that classroom teacher. And that can come in different forms, but we're offering a remedy situation in order for that teacher, or because that teacher is taking more than 2 designated students in their classroom. So if you have 5 designated students in the class, you have 3 remedy instances that we're looking at. So the first 2 and then the 3 additional. So what we're looking at here, we have circumstances where we know, just based on the number of designated students that are in a given school or at a given grade level, that we are going to have more than 2 designated students in the classroom. It's just a given. What we're then obligated to do is show best efforts, and you'll see here best efforts are listed. So we go through the exercise, and I'll tell you what we're doing here as well. We're comparing what I'll call old language. So the language that was in place after 2002, prior to the Supreme Court ruling. We're comparing that language and what it would look like in the school to what it looks like now with the restored language, because that helps drive our funding sources, whether we're looking at Classroom Enhancement Fund or we're looking at ministry funding for operations in our district here. So we know that there are classes that are going to be in a remedy situation or where we are non-compliant. Really what we make every effort to be is compliant with class size. And so when we go through the maximums and the reduced, and I'm sorry this isn't directly answering your question, but it's an extension of, it's an exercise where we're looking at, and it's in yellow here, and this is the guidelines that we're using. If by adding a division to a school, any of the individual classes drop below the reduced class size, adding a new division is not required and the maximum class size is used. So if we have a school that has a division that has more than 2 designated students in it, we have an obligation to be looking at adding an additional division to that school. So we go through the exercise, and if by adding that additional division, it drops us in any of those classes below the reduced class size that you see here, we don't have to add the extra class. We run the class be non-compliant by having more than 2 designated students, but we are paying remedy for those additional designations. So I'm not sure if that addresses your question.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to have a follow-up. It was a good answer because it's very complicated with holy ripple effects.
Yeah.
So the reason I ask this is because one of the things that we often get is my son wants to be in a class with his friend.
Yeah.
And so if child X has a designation and his friend has a designation and is in a class with other designations, is that often sometimes why we can't put those kids in the, like if there's 23 kids in the class and you can have a maximum of 24, and the parent is saying, hey, my child wants to be in that class, and they say the class size is only 23, so there's room, can we please put them in? Is this one of the reasons why we don't put them together?
Well, I'd say there's a number of reasons. That could be one of the considerations. So I'll tell you in terms of the work that's happening at the school level, we're working with staff committee, we're working with school-based teams, we're working with individual teachers. So I've mentioned that already, but those conversations are very important in terms of how we are placing students in classrooms. So although a parent may have put a request in to be to have their child in a particular teacher's classroom, there's a number of considerations that go into that, and it's not just about designations, but it could be about supports that are offered in terms of additional support to that classroom, and where the school then feels that a child is best placed, and they'll take the parent's request into consideration, but it's not going to be a given or the driver for how we're placing students.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Trustee no, I didn't have my hand up. It's Trustee Robinson.
Comment. This is my 3rd board, 8th year of going through this. And previously, we've been satisfied with, you've got kids coming into the district, kids going out, trying to find the right composition of class, and a dozen other problems. This is why every year it takes us a week or sometimes 2, maybe a little more, to get it right. We're satisfied. So my compliments to this board for wanting more detail, because, wow, that was an amazing summary and amazingly clear, and congratulations to both the board and to our staff for dealing with this every year. It's more complex than I had any idea. And I think I may have a question.
Okay. Thank you. Through the chair, I don't know if there is a follow-up question, but through the chair, if I can say, I would like to compliment our team here and the Department of Learning Services, but I would also like to extend that to, again, the work that's happening through the other departments, even in terms of just compiling this information to be able to present to you this evening. Tanya Sutton, Lolita Nelson, Pete Sabo were instrumental in helping me outline all of the processes we go through here. So I do want to give them credit for this this document, and I appreciate the sentiment about the usefulness of this exchange of information. So,
Well, thank you. I don't think you're getting off so early yet, because I have a long line of questions here. Trustee Keller.
Thank you, through the chair. So, thank you for the presentation. I really do have a new sense of appreciation for what goes into class placement for and what our staff do to make that happen. And it's definitely going to help me in responding to some of the comments that we receive from parents asking, well, why is it taking so long to get class placements? One question I did have, and this might be a couple of parts to it. Has there been any changes in our procedures in the last few years, other than the fact that we seem to be getting more students late in the enrollment game, that would result in challenges for us in placing final class assignments earlier in the school year? And two more parts, if I may. How does our sort of ability to assign final class placements compare with other districts? Because I have heard like, well, why are our students placed, but they are in other districts? And do we have any targets or measures of success for when we'd like ultimately to say, be able to tell parents, our goal is to have your students in classrooms by whatever it might be?
Let's do the first question. No,
Sorry.
I'll start with the third one. Our efforts are always to have students in classes as early as we can. I can tell you, again, at the secondary level, it's much different than at the elementary levels. Obviously, students are given a timetable, so the challenge that they have at the secondary level is with the number of sections or blocks that they have for a particular course, is making sure, as students are coming into that school, ensuring that we can offer a full timetable for those students. So that's the challenge at the secondary level. Sometimes what we're looking at with our more senior students, if we don't have offerings for a complete timetable for students, sometimes we're working and cross-enrolling students between our mainstream secondary school and Island Connect Ed. And so students may be taking online courses because we can't offer a full timetable. The challenge is really at the grade 8, 9, and 10 level with our younger secondary students in ensuring that we have space for a complete timetable. So they're working with Assistant Superintendent Balcombe in terms of numbers through that first week and second week in September. I think even into the third week, they're communicating how many spaces they have left as we're bringing more students in. So that's the challenge there. I believe that your second question was how do we compare to other districts? Is that
Generally.
generally? So I would say what we're looking at here, the work that's happening in other districts may be different. And again, we're in a unique position right now. Maybe provincially we are, but other districts may be more stable in terms of their intake of students. So student registrants, we're on an inclining registration pattern here, which is then driving more challenges for us in terms of our projections, but also knowing how many spaces we have in a particular school. So you can again see the number of students just from those between that June 16th date and the 13th date that are coming into our district here creates a lot of challenges that may be unique for us as compared to our neighboring districts. So that's an example. And I think your first question had to do with change. Can you remind me what it is again? Yeah. Through the chair.
Very good memory, if I may just clarify the question.
Yes.
So I was intending to ask, is this a trend that has been happening over the last few years, where it's been maybe taking a little bit longer than we would have liked to place students? And is there something that may there may be a reason for that, other than,
I'm going to say that there are probably two main reasons for this, and I'm going to extend it beyond the last couple of years, but again, it's a positive for our district that we're seeing increased enrollment. More students coming into the district is a good thing for us. That creates more challenges in terms of our startup. But in addition to that, and we're going back, I guess, 4 years, we're going back to a language that didn't exist, and particularly class size numbers have changed, so we're seeing a reduction in the number of students that we can have in a given classroom. That creates more challenges, and we're also seeing, again, our best efforts for the no more than 2 also creates challenges. So where prior to the Supreme Court ruling, we were obviously concerned about the class placements, but we weren't looking at the no more than 2 language. We were creating our divisions based on information we had, and at that time we were actually looking at declining enrollment, so we didn't have the same challenge of the combination of the two aspects. So I think those 2 pieces combined are creating greater challenges as we're going forward, but we're into, I think, going into year 4 for the reinstated language, and within that, we're getting better at moving. It's just new students coming in. It's positive, but it creates different challenges. That's right. Thank you.
I just wanted to follow the question that was happening there. The question, the statement actually that Trustee Keller had made around the, we can see through that we have, sorry, what was the word? So I wrote it down here. Around that, we can see that the numbers have been increasing around transfers and new students. And that's what I was wondering about. And I know that we only have the numbers from this year,
right.
But the reason why I was wondering was because I'm trying to understand if there has been an increase of activity within transfers and new students, and how that may be impacting our processes. So that's why I was trying to understand that, because I don't know if it is in fact increasing this activity, because all I have is the snapshot from this 1 year. So that's what I was trying to understand. So I'm wondering if that is in fact, if that's a fact, that it is increasing during that time. And my actual question is, I'm just wondering how international students come into play with this process. When do they get accounted for, and when are the decisions made around international students, and what seats will be made available for them?
So the first aspect of your question through the chair, again, I don't have the data in front of me for last year or the year before. What I can say is that we continue to be on an upward trend in terms of increased enrollments. So we have not only the transfers, but we have more students coming into our district, which again just adds to these numbers. It's again a positive for our district. So what we're seeing is, I don't know how many new students, even out of this number here, it's not final for me as to how many new students have come into our district. Again, what we are seeing though is an increase in student enrollment, which is then driving or adding to this number here. It just adds to the challenges that we have in terms of startup for schools. Again, a positive, but challenges, we get through it. Pleased to say, at the elementary level, the majority of our schools were in work by the end of the first week. Many of them were given the go-ahead by the Wednesday of the second week, and the last few were given the go-ahead by the Friday of the second week. And those schools were schools where we added additional divisions to meet compliance. So it was positive for those schools because they were able to reorganize their schools and have students in classes. Was the second part of your question there, or was that the second part? International. International students are placed throughout this process here. So Yeah, if you want to speak to
that?
that.
Sure,
please go ahead.
yeah. Through the chair. So our international students also do projections. So our principal of international education does projections for how many students we're going to have for the following year. Any of our current international students that are returning for the following year go through the same course selections at the secondary level. So in January and February, they would pick their courses for the following year. For those students who are not currently here, our international teachers and principal work to try to determine what country those students projected will be coming from, whether they're coming for half a year, for a whole year, whether they're coming for English language acquisition or coming to graduate. And they try to kind of do some mock-up course selections to leave room in those spaces so that over the spring and the summer, as those international students register, we've got seats in the right courses for them. So it's all part of the same kind of projections and timetable building process.
Can you speak to the homestay challenges that we have?
Yeah, and then of course the international principal of international programs also works hard with our homestay coordinators to try to figure out a balance between schools that have space. So a school might say we've got room in our grade 10 class for up to 10 or 12 international students, but the homestay coordinators also have to find homestays in that catchment area of school, and it's at that grade level, and it's not always a fit, right? Someone might say, yeah, we can have homestays, we prefer somebody in grade 8, and they were like, could you take someone in grade 12? No, we'd prefer not to. So there's all kinds of phone calls and flurry of activity trying to make the best match for them.
Thank you. First of all, I also want to concur that I greatly appreciate the level of detail in this presentation, the quality of your work, all three of you. Thank you very much. I just want to circle back to a question or a comment that Trustee O'Neill said regarding being conservative and the gap between what we project and what we end up with. Through the chair to possibly the Secretary Treasurer or to Mr. Davey, I'm not sure who would fit. Do we have, how hard, would it take a lot of effort to graph over, say, the last 5 years, how we've done, in terms of how big the gap is between two? Yeah. And is there value in that for us in terms of when we're doing our budgeting to know that?
Yes, we do have that information and we can track it and go back over time, not something that I have available right now.
No, I wouldn't expect it to be one.
But yeah, there's always a danger in going too far in terms of those projections. So we tend to use the more accurate projection for planning purposes, and we're getting into the long-range facilities planning, so more for that sort of thing. But when it comes to funding, it's not something that we want to over-project.
Absolutely.
And then suddenly that not come to fruition.
So it's all about trying to find the sweet spot.
But to answer your question, yes, we can certainly provide that information.
Okay.
Trustee McKay.
Thank you. Just trying to figure out what I was going to say. Through the chair to all of our staff, I believe that what we've discovered through this presentation is probably the reason that October is National Principals Month. Yes. So
They're too busy in September.
Thank you for that.
They're too busy in September.
And Trustee Dickinson?
Thanks. On a bit of a different note on all of this, when I look at all the work that goes in early on to course descriptors and stuff and making courses for our secondary students for the following year, I'm wondering what the possibility of going to per student funding at the grade 10 to 12 level and not knowing if that's going to happen until March for next year will do to our planning. Will it have any impact on our planning? And I mean, I think in the long run it might help with some of the administrative effort here, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is not the time to have this conversation, but.
I don't think it'll change, because I think we plan on students being full-time students and taking a full complement of courses. And we build timetables based on the course requests. So I don't think that that process will change, even if the funding model changes.
Again, I don't have the figures in front of me, but we're one of those districts where there isn't a great deal of difference between one full-time student per student taking more than that. Is that?
Like 7.4 versus 8.1 versus 10.1.
Exactly, yeah. we're very close to that.
Very close to 8. Ooh.
Hey, Trustee O'Neill.
Okay, and thank you through the chair. I just wanted to add to Chair Trustee McKay's point and say that I don't believe you when you say that there's months here that you're taking vacation and stuff. Because when I look at this chart, every month of the year is accounted for. So just you may try to squeeze some time in there, but I firsthand saw how hard people were working over those summer months. So you can try to trick us and say that vacation's being had, but I don't know if that's truthful.
2 weeks when the system shut in.
Now we know why the system shut down.
So if we may,
Yes.
we have more to our presentation. So ask Assistant Superintendent Tate is going to come up next, and maybe your 45-minute presentation. Compare that down to, no, I'm just joking. Great, thank you.
Next slide.
It's a hard act to follow. But I think Deputy Davey has given a really good, detailed, comprehensive overview of all of the annual impacts that we have at this sort of the beginning of the school year. So I'm just going to share a small bit of information around those impacts and what that looks like in actions and activities in the schools themselves. So in preparation, you received a few documents to look at, and one of them is our AP 339 student grade placement. Essentially, that AP talks about keeping children together with their age-alike peers. It speaks to class placements being very much a collaborative process, and it speaks to acceleration and deceleration, if you will, the old pass-fail kind of language, and that we try to avoid that as much as possible to allow children to develop naturally with their age-alike peers. That's kind of the summary of that AP. But I thought it was important to draw your attention to the fact that we have an AP around building classes. So most of the questions and the information I'll share with you is around elementary. I think the deputy has given you a pretty comprehensive overview of both elementary and secondary. So classroom placement, I'll just highlight the fact that class placements, you've heard already some of the impacts or some of the considerations that principals need to take when they're putting classes together. So it's a collaborative process with all the staff, both horizontally and vertically, so we can look at last year's teacher, this year's teacher, next year's teacher, all of that information, and that we look at the child as a whole human being. All of their beauty, so their emotional well-being, academic, physical, all of those pieces are all taken into consideration. And of course, we've got class size and composition. We have things like that teachers moved grades and that, these children had that teacher last year, so we'd like them to be with a new teacher, or parent requests. So all of those things are of course taken into consideration. But most importantly, I want to emphasize that the school staff looks at the whole child. And that's no different when they're building the classes and we have this combined class phenomenon, which is more common than not. So they're more common actually than straight grade classes. Again, the whole child is looked at as a whole person. All of those things are taken into consideration. And these multi-grade classrooms are quite common. We're looking at things like the children's competencies versus, and the curriculum has moved more towards competencies than it is content. So if you could view K to 7 almost on a continuum of learning. And so regardless of whether you've got a straight grade 3 class or a combined 3-4, if you could think about the curriculum on that continuum, take it into account also the children's passions and where they're at in their learning, and all of those things are taken into consideration by the classroom teacher when planning for those combined grades. Okay.
Thank you. I was reviewing the placement information that was in the agenda and the presentation, and so I have a question around decelerations and accelerations as well, but probably more so for the decelerations. In the past, the practice was, and I'm going back quite a bit of time here, the practice was that those decelerations would come to the board.
as a part of the decision process. Now, I'm not suggesting that that is what I would like, but what I would think might be important for the board is to have that come to us for information, just with respect to oversight. So I guess my question through the chair is really to the superintendent to consider bringing forward those decelerations so that we're aware of them, to understand possible patterns throughout the system, just for our oversight purposes. Just something to consider. It's a bit of a change. So I appreciate the process that's there, and I guess I just would like more information at some point in time.
Through the chair, may I comment on that would be a really easy, very easy thing to do. As it stands now, the document that you received, these beautiful ones that look like this, they're still missing a couple of the back pages. You can see the table of contents speaks specifically to acceleration, deceleration, but those aren't included because they're still in draft. We're still working those through in terms of process. So anytime either an acceleration or deceleration is requested, it comes to the Department of Learning Services for a holistic decision-making, and it has to come formally in writing, and there's a process that we go through around those. So we keep track of all those, so reporting that back out to the board would be no problem.
Could you say generally what we do there? I know we take each case on its own.
We take every,
merits,
yes.
Of course, but can you give the board a general idea of how those go? What research says about that?
Sure. So we do take every single case on its individual merit and its context because every situation is quite different. We've done copious amounts of research on this, and we have those available in parent information format as well as principal format, so you can talk articulately about the topic. It's not the research doesn't support acceleration or deceleration. Again, not across the board, every case is individual, but the research doesn't support that. What we should be doing first, and what we do first, is we adapt, we communicate, we look at the child where they're at, we try to build these beautiful universally designed classrooms with differentiated instruction so that the child can have the sense of belonging with their peers. We go through all of those pieces. We go through a response to intervention process where interventions are put in place and we measure them, and we have tiers 1, 2, and 3, and all of those things need to be exhausted. It would have to be at the very minimum a year-long process, if not more, to demonstrate that all of those steps have been taken before we would consider and entertain that, right?
So if I may add as well, when we're looking at that year-long process, and it is documented, we're looking at full involvement of a school-based team and full involvement of the parents in that decision-making process.
Thank you.
Just curious, for the acceleration and deceleration, roughly how many requests are you getting from parents each year for either?
Okay, so they're not always parent requests. They have to come through us to the principal, but many of them are. Did you say each year?
Just roughly. Is it sort of like
not many?
2, 3 a year?
Yeah,
5?
I would say half a dozen. I mean, we could maybe, I would say half a dozen roughly, give or take.
And is it more acceleration requests?
No, I'd say they're fairly even. And all for very good reasons, right? Yeah. Oh, we're all staring at each other, sorry. So again, the deputy gave you a very good overview of the startup in September, the first few weeks of September. I just wanted to pull a few high-level themes because there is that week or week and a half or 2 where students aren't nestled into their permanent placements for that school year. So leave it to the brilliance of schools, principals, teachers, their community members. They make these this week or 2 creatively very, very successful. So some of the things that they focus on maybe is having students visit their previous teachers, meeting new teachers, meeting all teachers, and so they have that sense of familiarity. They might set them back with the teacher they had last year to ease them in before they settle into their classrooms, but a focus on relationships is a definite theme. Assessments is another, that some schools have dug right into our NLPS screener right away, because why wait? And we've got that time where we don't need them to be in there necessarily in their permanent classrooms for that year. We've done all sorts of literacy assessments. I've even heard schools are doing the how many adults do you know in the building that care about your success kinds of data collection, numeracy collection. So that's certainly prominent. Addressing school codes of conduct and behavioral expectations in whole group ways, in really fun experiential ways. We've got groups focusing on the core competencies through 6 seaters, through those types of things, but certainly addressing competencies and behavior. Loads and loads of school-wide activities, and this is a beautiful celebration because kids can come in and they can be in groups with their siblings, right? So they can come in with, if they have siblings, they can be in some of those multi-age groups, which they don't always get a chance to do that. And so those activities can be based around books and themes, whether they're codes of conduct types of themes, whether they're Indigenous themes or core competency themes, but the whole school can be focusing on the same topic for that first week or two. And again, just the bottom one, just having those family groups has been very successful, having siblings and multi-age groups together. Okay.
I see the word assessments up there, and I'm getting some questions lately from people about tests and how their kids are getting tested so early in the year, but I'm assuming they're getting assessed. Can you give a little update on the difference between a test and an assessment?
Sure, you bet. So, I guess if I were to put it really crudely, an assessment would be something that's more formative, that we are going to see where the children are at in some of their core areas. Teachers are going to use that information to inform their instruction moving forward, which is why having that earlier in the year obviously is really useful. Test, I suppose, could be categorized as a summative assessment, still an assessment, but that's sort of at the end of a unit, at the end of a learning activity where we're testing what the children know and what they recall from that particular activity or that learning event.
That may or may not count for marks.
May or may not count for marks.
But an assessment won't count for marks.
Assessment won't count for marks.
And Trustee O'Neill?
Thank you, and I'm going to piggyback off this question a bit because I was thinking along the same lines here. But now your answer has maybe made me think a little different because I've got my note here, good to know that these assessments can happen in those early days, because from what I've been hearing there is some concern as well that it's delay, where the child isn't getting their assessment until they're settled in that classroom. Right. So initially when you had presented this point, thinking, okay, well, at least that component, but there was this part that was making me wonder, if they're not settled in the classroom, how can a true assessment be done? Mm-hmm. Specifically, a more formative one, the test one would actually, in my mind, be absolutely impossible. So can you sort of expand a bit on that? Because maybe I'm not understanding, and I want to be really clear here when I do talk with folks who are wondering how their child is being possibly assessed during that window of time.
So if we take the NLPS reading screener, for example, that's a screener that we have district-wide that we've had for many years now. Yeah. And if we know that a child is now with their previous year's teacher, a teacher that they have been in school with for the whole year, the previous year, so they already have an established relationship with that teacher, and that support staff, they'll have known the support staff, of course, as well. And they're doing the assessment there, they've got that familiarity, likely that safety. Now, if you look at it the other way, they're in a brand new class with brand new students and with a brand new teacher that they don't have yet an established relationship with, maybe, not necessarily, and then doing the assessment there, it almost makes more sense to be somewhere where you feel familiar, the teacher's well aware of your strengths and your challenges, and so we can get ahead and we can do that straight away, because in many cases, they're not situated with their next year's teacher, or this year coming up, they're actually with their previous year's teacher. Does that answer your question?
It does, and I have a general comment, but you can add me on the list if it's...
I'm actually next, which is to follow up on this.
To what extent can these screeners be used as like learning disability screeners as well? Do they give us a little bit of insight where there are potentially either significant weaknesses or significant variation among abilities?
That's exactly the purpose of a screener, is to perhaps let us be alerted to a red flag, to alert us to do more testing, and perhaps go to level B testing, a higher level testing, for sure.
So, okay, thank you, through the chair. So my comment is this, as you're going through all these points,
Yeah.
I really think this is about establishing community. So, you know, it is like this, you know, making lemonade out of lemons type of a thing, because you can really spin it, if you will, to be a positive. Specifically, you know, when you talk about the reintroduction and, you know, transferring students more naturally, I think, to a new teacher, but the piece on school expectations and school code of conduct, and I think back to some of the presentations we had last, I've always said term, but you know what I'm saying, I think, around bullying and harassment and things that we need to address in our schools. This really feels like a way that, you know, it's not what we're used to or what we've done, but it actually, seeing it laid out like this does make sense to me. So I just wanted to make that statement because, well, I just like to share what's on my mind.
Oh, I love it. And if you were to look at my notes, you've just summarized my portion of the presentation.
And I didn't reread.
Did you get my photocopy notes on the back side here? It really was to say that it is a beautiful opportunity for schools to build community, and no doubt every school has taken the opportunity with open arms to make lemonade out of lemons, for sure. No, it's good. So I was just going to leave with a few real life examples from this year as to some of the things that occurred during this first week or two. We had grade 7s that acted as leaders for some of these different multi-age groups. We had schools doing random acts of kindness. We've had STEAM or STEM, it's the math science type activities around a book called The Most Magnificent Thing, and students built their most magnificent thing. We've had community cleanups, we've had beach cleanups, family picnics where families were invited in. We've had math assessments, literacy assessments, school-wide artwork projects throughout this time that were then displayed throughout the school, all around building community. And I just want to emphasize that schools are starting to more and more work towards finding out from students who they believe the adults are in the building that believe in them and support their success. And during this assessment time, we have the time to sit down with kids and talk about that.
I just want to, so this is really important information, and I feel that it's important information for parents and students to know about the value of how we use those first few weeks in September as a method of building community within our schools. I feel like that would alleviate a lot of anxiety if we were able to communicate out whether it's making lemonade out of lemons or whether or not, you know, it's intentional and regardless, I think that we somehow communicate to parents and the value of spending that time building community and reintroducing back into school, I think that would filter down to students. So whether we communicate directly with students or it's just parents and that filters down, because there is that anxiety, and I think that's why, you know, we've peppered you all with questions tonight, is because we are getting a lot of that anxiety from parent comments and questions. And so I'm wondering if there's a way that we can reach out to the community a bit more and, you know, point out that there's some intention in these 2 weeks.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
And the superintendent should sing a song about it.
That seems to get
Seems appropriate.
a lot of attention.
No comment.
Good call.
And just before I move on to the kind of structure for presentations at the Education Committee, I just want to give a little secondary perspective, because I've heard lots of really good questions around best practices and organizations and what happens kind of in startup as we prepare. So I want you to either think back to when you were 15 years old, or if that was too painful, imagine a 15-year-old or 3 15-year-olds. And in our secondary schools in January and February, we asked them to make decisions around their course selections for their grade 11 and 12 years. So you're 15 years old, and the counselors go through a process. And through the guidance of the counselors and the wisdom of all the information they have, they ask them to make decisions in January and February about what they would like to take the following September, and then in the grade 12 year the following year. So they have kind of that broad view. So our 3 students, we'll call them student A, B, and C for lack of creativity, they make their course selections wisely with their parents' input, their counselors' input. They pick courses. And then the school builds a timetable based around those selections. And then late August, through MyEd, a message gets sent out saying timetables are available for students to view. So student A looks, and all of the classes they wanted are there. Student B looks, a lot of the classes they wanted aren't there. And student C looks, and all of the classes they wanted are there. And the first day of school arrives, and they walk into school. So what typically happens in our schools around the district. Student A, all the classes they want, goes to class, and nothing changes. Their day one's the same as 3 weeks later. Everything's great. Student number 2, who a whole bunch of classes on their timetable don't match what they picked back in February. But you know what? Their interests have changed, and that timetable they have is perfect, and off they go. It's like it just worked out magically. And student C, whose classes are exactly what they wanted, runs down the counseling area and says, change everything. Because it's 7 months later, their life has changed, their interests have changed. Their interest in music has changed, their hairstyle has changed, their clothing has changed, everything in life has changed. So schools are scrambling trying to figure out how do you build a timetable in the spring for students who walk in the door in September, and they don't match perfectly. But likewise, there's lots of those different challenges around, how do you get kids in that frame of mind and try to make them have good decisions. So it's adolescence is what it is. Moving on to the next little thing here. You have seen something in this formation or another way back starting in November. So as a board, you got rolling on the whole notion of the board goals in the strategic plan, which led into the 4 goals that we have and all of the objectives. For our district staff and our school leaders, the first time we saw the draft strategic plan for what the board has approved just this last month was in August. So for us, this is new for us rolling out in the system. We're trying to find the best way for us to frame this with the work that we do. And in our conversations around presentations to the Education Committee, we thought we would share our thoughts around one way of developing presentations. So from the board goals and objectives, Laura and I spent some time kind of putting together a bit of a mock-up that we think is a way for us that we've shared out with principals and vice principals as we move forward with the system. So you can see across the top is the board vision. This is our North Star. This is our aspiration. This is what we want to be. So if we're making progress on this a year, 2, 3 years from now, people say, what is NLPS all about? We would say it's a courageous, innovative, inclusive, and personalized learning community that inspires success for all. That's who we are. That's where we're going. So that's our vision. You can see the 4 board goals are in their own colors, and we put them in a little model that overlaps because we want to be able to have schools pull apart the goals and work on them individually. So we want schools to have the ability to say, we're working on a truth and reconciliation piece right now, and that's our focus. Or we're working on a curricular and assessment piece. That's where we're focusing our attention. But we also want them to be able to overlap them and be able to say, you know what, current work we're doing with this group of students or this group of teachers is a truth and reconciliation and an inclusion piece. So those 2 goals are overlapping. And right in the middle, of course, is the sweet spot where we want all 4 goals overlapping. So you can't tell what the school's doing. They're doing everything all at once. They're just living it. And then we put our all of the values that we have in the district kind of a little bit recessed back. So they're ever present, and you can pull them forward, and we kind of bold those at some time. So maybe we'll pull one forward where we'll say, right now we've got a bit of an emphasis on collaboration, or maybe it's on diversity, or maybe this time it's an inclusion piece. So we kind of pull those things forward. So that's kind of the model that we're rolling out with the system. We're trying to get people to live and breathe in September going forward this year, the work that you've been living and breathing for the better part of a year now. So that's kind of where we're at. So with the Education Committee presentations, we were hoping that we would compile presentations based around those 4 goals. And if people came forward and said we'd like to do a presentation to the board, or if the board said we would like to hear a presentation on this, we would take whatever this is and put it through the lens of the board's work and say, you know what, which goal most closely aligns with this, so that the board can view this as progress towards one of these goals. So a presentation might come along, continuous improvement, instruction, and assessment. And so a group could be a group of teachers, or even if a community group is coming and sharing their links with what we're doing, we would ask, how is it aligned to the board goals? And they would say, this is the work we're doing. We'd say, that's instruction and assessment. That's where it slots in. Obviously, for each of the 4 goals. And I would say today, if you said, well, what were we talking about today? All of the questions you had and all of the responses and information that was shared, for me, would fit within the inclusion goal and the diversity of our community. How do we balance the needs of our diverse students? How do we include our families that are moving in late over the summer? How do we meet the needs of those students who are trying to find a place to fit in? How do schools organize those students and support those teachers to make it work best for everybody? So I would say, if you said, well, where does this presentation slot in? I would say we would have put it here in our safe, caring, and healthy schools, because that's where most of the emphasis of the work was done. And then if as we go through the year, and our hope is, and that was in our kind of our planning committee through the board, the education committee chair and vice chair, was to have the board see over the next kind of 8 months hit at least each of those goals twice. And we know some of the presentations will come that will overlap. Someone's going to come and say, you know what, we've got something here that we think is an environmental stewardship and sustainability and truth and reconciliation presentation all rolled into one. And we'll say, you know what, that's perfect. Those two goals are going to be presented to the board through this presentation. And hopefully by the end of the year, we might have one that comes in and they just have that sweet spot, all 4 happening at the same time. And you'll say, hopefully that'll be the last one of the year. And if not the last one of this year, that's where we're going next year, right, as we try to implement that 3-year strategic plan to make that work. So that's kind of our framework, and we're hoping that as you prepare for your education committees meetings each month, when you get the agenda, you'll be like, this is the presentation that we're going to see. This is where it aligns with the board goals. And this is a part of a sequence for where as we go through the year. So that's kind of our planning model.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Trustee Briscoe?
Just going back a few steps when you referenced students' timetabling in secondary school and you referenced parent input. Is it parent input or parent approval? Do parents have to sign off on course changes?
Most schools ask parents to have some input in the final course selections, and there's an opportunity for parents to do that. But it's difficult to wait until all of the parents have signed off on I've approved this. So there's a lot of work that gets done ahead of time, and then it kind of rolls through.
I guess, and I may have followed, what I'm thinking of is, if I'd been allowed to, I would have dropped chemistry and maybe not graduated. So that's going to be on the counselor to make sure that student doesn't drop.
So let's say a student comes in September and they've got this academic, pathway forward because the parents have been very involved and they've made decisions, this is where I want to go. And the student comes in and says, I would like to dump all of these classes that my parents would like me to take and take all of these ones. That's not going to happen, right? Okay. That would be a phone call to the parent saying, hey, your son or daughter is sitting in my office here and they've got quite a change in their plans. Tell me a little bit about that. And they'd be like, absolutely not. They're trying to cop out.
Okay, so, thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that we had that safeguard in place.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I've lost in thought over that. I know Trustee Higginson has a question. I'm throwing myself on the list.
It's a request. I like the new presentation style. I think it's fantastic. I would also request maybe that we carry it through to board action sheets, and that whenever possible, that board action sheets also link to our strategic plan. The recommendation or the action that we have is linked to how it's furthering our strategic plan. It's not always possible, but when it is, I think it would be great.
I guess I just want to come back to that. Perhaps I'm going off on a tangent. Back to timetables and parental. Honestly, I'm a bit surprised that it is a parental approval situation. Is there an age at which point, just because children are able to consent to their own birth control use without parent approval, their own psychological therapy without parental approval. So at what point in time are children deemed the authorities of their own future? Or is
does that occur?
Like the course change process or?
Yeah, is there a point in time, like if you turn 16, it is now, do we have any kind of established age limit, or is there any kind of assumptions or requirements by law that we either work in the school district or legal about age limits around that? I'm just really surprised that it hasn't been contested. That's fundamentally where I'm kind of saying, tell me more.
Think of it more of not so much as parents saying, I'm going to have my son or daughter take courses they don't want to take. It's more of the school communication with the parents. So most schools will do a parent night to say, here's the course selection process, do all the pathways to graduation, answer lots of questions, and then let the parents know their son or daughters are engaging in the course selection process. Please go along with them, and if you have a chance to kind of sign off on that, that's great. That's more of an acknowledgement that the school knows that there's been a conversation at home, as opposed to kids going home and coming back saying, oh yeah, I talk to my parents about this all the time. So we want the parents in the conversation. When push comes to shove, the students always win, because even if parents come in and say, I refuse to let my son or daughter drop that class, even if the counselor says, fine, we'll leave them in the class, guess what happens? They don't go to class. They don't do the work. They win that battle all the time. So usually that conversation is more of a conversation around, what are you wanting for your son or daughter here, and why are they not wanting that experience? So yeah, it's not so much of the parents get the last say, and at a certain age that the kids take over. Very young children win those battles with parents around that. So it's more of a communication piece, right?
Because you asked me to go back when I was 15. And
you went back and you're like, no way was I being told what to do. And just as you're encouraged to go paperless here, which I think is wonderful, most schools have an electronic process. So the kids do online course selections at the secondary level, and they don't print out a copy. It doesn't go home in a paper copy. Which causes a little bit of anxiety for school staff sometimes, because they're like, well, how will the parents know? And it's like, well, they can go on to MyEdBC and they can see online just as well as the students can. So it's like, well, what if we lose it? It's like, it's backed up, it's there, trust us, you don't need that staff. It's some anxiety.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Alrighty, well, we've kept you here an awfully long time, so thank you very much. That was really informative. And here is the challenge of going paperless. So I do want to just quickly summarize. I mean, I think that the number of questions that we had and the length of time we kept you is reflective of the anxiety and concern that parents have around this time. So I do really appreciate all of your effort and time into that. Superintendent Saywell?
Thank you. Through the chair, I'll ask you to turn to page 23. This is just a little bit of information and dovetails nicely on what Assistant Superintendent Belcom was speaking to around the strategic plan. And it's timely because I am off to what is called the Framework for Enhancing Student Learning, FESL, meeting tomorrow in Richmond. So in the background information here speaks to this idea that used to be more of an accountability framework before July 1st, 2015, and there were all of these sort of accountability documents that you can see here: district literacy plans, student achievement plans, school planning councils, and they all ended when school districts got a little better at strategic planning. So strategic planning initiatives took over, and it would be one element of what is an entire framework for improving student achievement called the Framework for Enhancing Student Learning. So what that looks like in our district, we've started on this strategic planning process, a very comprehensive one. So I'll be part of this 9-member committee to look at how we can do better planning. And I think I'm well positioned to do that after what we've gone through. I think a very comprehensive and well-developed strategic planning process. That's one element. And then there's the staff operational plan that adds to that. And then there are school plans that add to that, all that should be in alignment with the ministry plan for student achievement. Then you add things like the budget process that should also take into account our strategic direction. And then finally, we report on that, called a district review story at the end of the year, which I did for the first time last year. All of that process, sort of this cycle of continuous planning and improvement, again, is called the Framework for Enhancing Student Learning. And throughout that process, the idea is, again, we've done a very good job of this, that there would be some community engagement process throughout. So school plans engage students and teachers and parents. Our process engages the community in a variety of ways. We did public forums, we did online engagement processes, and information sessions. All of those things add to that framework. Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools is part of this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 districts that you can see on the page here. That is adding to this framework, and we're talking about this as a pilot district. If you turn the page, just so you're aware, some of these, if you read these guiding principles, I'm not going to read them all, but if you read those guiding principles and think about our strategic planning process, we can just tick off the boxes. I'll hop all over here, but reflects a system-wide commitment to continuous improvement and lifelong learning, absolutely. Focuses on the intellectual, career, and human and social development. Creates a wide focus on student learning to ensure each student in BC achieves their full potential, and so on. On the other page, on the last page, page 25, it says at the top, and this is where NLPS gets involved, an important part of this work will be sharing promising district and school planning and improvement efforts that enhance student learning. So that's what I'll be doing tomorrow with other districts. And finally, under resources, there are some links to what the ministry has provided as sample resources for strategic planning. NLPS could easily be one of these sample resources for the rest of the province to look at. So just a little information about what our district is involved with at a provincial level. Questions?
Forgive me.
Trustee Brzovic.
Thank you. Through the chair, and forgive me, Mr. Sable, but I have to just make sure, because someone will ask me. Special needs is all encompassing, like would that be the full range including gifted students? Or is that more our designated students?
To what are you referring?
Oh, so I apologize. I didn't guiding principles bullet number 4.
Yes.
Addresses different among particular groups of students, most notably Indigenous children in care and students with special needs.
Yeah, so if you went to our strategic plan, we mention all of those separate student groups as each area as one that we want to see improvement in.
Thank you.
So we align perfectly.
Trustee Barron?
Yes, thank you, through the chair. I'm trying to understand. If you could please
Yes.
clarify.
Yeah.
So I guess
I'm trying to understand, well, for information, I guess, how or where are the other districts as far as the development of a strategic plan for their own districts? And how is our status of our completed strategic plan going to play into this? And will it be to our benefit? I'm just trying to understand how the work that we've done is going to be interconnected a little bit more clear, please.
I would say that districts are in different, we're all over the place as far as how well we do strategic planning. And I'll say again, as I will tomorrow, we do a very good job. We went through a very comprehensive process to come up with our strategic plan. We went out to the community, we listened, and we have a very good strategic plan. Other districts, not so much. We took a great deal of time, which is part of what I'm so proud about, and we included all of our partner groups and interest groups. That was really good planning on our part. Other districts aren't at the same level, and other districts do just as well as we do. And it's sort of, they're looking for input from a variety of districts at different levels of that strategic planning.
Can I just follow up? So is the purpose of this to have, as it say, a system-wide, so they're looking for having a plan that's more at the provincial level? And will we be able to take components of what we've done?
Yeah, it's
from our local
It's a little bit about, as I said on that, on page 25, sharing promising practice is certainly part of this process, so we can all learn something from other districts, why I'm quite happy to be involved in this. You know, the ministry is weighing in on some ideas that they have around strategic planning, and might have some input around certain indicators of success that they would like to see districts put into their strategic or operational plans. And so I'll also add that I'm not sure where trustees will have input into this process right now, but of course they play a significant role in strategic planning.
I have myself on that list next. So to follow up, I mean, I literally have system-wide focus written as a cue to my question. So I'm going to follow up on Trustee Barron's question, just so I can understand what the intent, what the intent of this is, and I guess more specifically is, it really is there a predefined intention about what the outcome will be? So when I read this, I have the same question: is are they intending to create a system, like a provincial level framework about how school districts perhaps can evaluate themselves on how they improve student learning? Do you understand, like, what are they, is there already a preconceived notion about what the outcome would look like, or is this just a really preliminary discussion part?
I'll know more after tomorrow. I'm optimistic that we're being brought together so that the ministry can listen to how districts are sort of doing their strategic plans. And I think the point is we want to share and improve on that. So I'm going into this with that mindset.
Okay, thank you. Trustee O'Neill.
Thank you. First I'll say, I don't think it ever hurts to have the ear of the ministry, and I think that we should be honored as a board, quite frankly, to be a part of this process. And I want to ask you if you think there could be potential in this type of a process to actually, not just collaborate with other districts and find some best practices, but also to find some places where the ministry may actually come out of this and say, hey, we need to pay more attention to this. Hey, we need to give these districts more money. Is that a possibility?
Well, I wouldn't hold our breath, but I believe there's an opportunity there to learn about what other districts are doing, and to share best practice. I am interested in what the ministry believes strategic planning looks like as well. And so we've been on, this isn't a bad thing, we've been on this since 2015. And I think it's appropriate that we're brought together to talk about what districts are doing and what's working, and that we're adhering to some of these principles, guiding principles. I think that's a good thing. Sound like a politician there.
Trustee McGuire.
On that note, is we could trade positions if you want. I think where I'm looking at this is from the trustee perspective and hoping that when, I'll put it on the table right away, that it's my assumption that you'll do this anyways, but that you would frame this in how much our board valued the strategic planning process to make sure that we had our local beliefs heard, built into that piece of it. I suppose, because we're all accountable for this. This is kind of the essence of what we're here for, is student achievement and learning, you know, when you look right down the line into the School Act. If you can share that piece on, because we've heard it in a couple of different places through the funding model review, where they want to look at strategic planning and what they're going to add in there. And all of those pieces, I think it's really important. But I think that it's also important for them to understand that our board and our district came to, through a very holistic process, came to identifying and being able to check off all of these boxes without being told that we had to do it. And I think that that's an important piece that they should be aware of. So the things that they're saying are their guiding principles we came to, but holistically.
Yeah, I'll respond through the chair by saying that the ministry, while they may have some ideas about strategic planning and what districts should be doing, I would not expect the district to mandate anything to districts around strategic planning or results. In the same way, Learning Services doesn't tell schools how to prepare a school plan, because that has to be a local developed plan where people can buy into it. In the same way we did it, right? And to your point, that's why it worked so well.
Thank you. Trustee Higginson?
So there will be more information on this at the, for boards that will be involved. So there'll be more information at the Board Chairs Day and at the Liaison Day in the middle of October as well, that the Superintendent, Secretary, Treasurer, and the Board Chair go to be able to come back with more information as well on it. But this also is part of, if, you know, throughout the funding model review, there is a lot of talk about accountability, and this is actually the accountability part that they're talking about. And it is the idea behind it from the provincial perspective is that it is a province-wide framework to ensure that school districts are moving forward around 5 goals, provincial goals. They want to know that every school district is paying attention to these 5 goals. We've had lots of conversations about whether these are actually goals or indicators of success, and I'm sure you'll have lots more information about that tomorrow. But the goals are things like students will feel safe and welcome in the schools, students will graduate, students will meet or exceed literacy for each grade level. So those are the 5 indicators of success. I don't think they're goals. The 5 indicators of success that they want to make sure that everybody across the province is working on. But there'll be more from their perspective on it, I think, at the day that you guys will be going to understand more of their perspective. So hearing these questions, I think it's going to be really interesting to hear their responses to them.
Trustee Ben?
Thank you. I'm just so curious. I do agree with Trustee O'Neill that
This is great that we've been selected, is the word used, to participate in this. I think it's a great opportunity for our district. I am very curious, though, as to, correct me if I'm wrong, the board involvement in this. There seems to be a lot of discussion around sort of, my perception of this is that it seems to be looking at a governance oversight sort of side of education, and yet, from what I'm hearing, the board is not involved, and that they're being provided with information but not involved in the process. And I'm wondering if we have any, and I know this was a decision made on the ministry's part, but I'm wondering if we have any information as to why boards are not active participants in this process.
Through the chair, that's one of my questions for tomorrow. So the framework for enhancing student learning is a big animal that's bigger than just, you know, the board's piece of strategic planning, right? And encompasses all the things I mentioned earlier. But it's one of the questions that I have, that how will this work intersect with what boards do? Because as Trustee Higginson mentioned, and of course is involved at the provincial level, if there is a sense that there are going to be mandated some initiatives, whether you call them indicators of success or whatever, I wouldn't look very good if I came back from some meetings and said, hey, here's what we're doing now. That doesn't fly. And so that's one of my questions about how we'll include trustees in this work.
I'm going next. I'm wondering, is there a space, do you think, so from the chair to you, but you know, is there a space for the SAETSIS policy to be part of this discussion? Because I'm thinking, because when you use the word accountability, obviously we're talking about a really classic understanding, traditional understanding of accountability. But when we think about UNDRIP and we think about the intention behind SAETSIS, it's a different type of accountability. I don't know if you see that there could be any role for that policy, and particularly because it's foundational or overarching, whatever we end up deciding, you know, from our strategic plan. But I guess I don't know if there is that opportunity or if you see it being relevant, but I just want to propose that thought out there, because I feel like from a provincial level, or it might be useful to kind of start incorporating, I've lost it now, incorporating thoughts, if you will, concepts, if you will, that are like the SAETSIS policy in school districts' thinking. Is that?
Well, it really disrupts the sort of typical strategic directions that most boards sort of develop. And so, yeah, I think it makes for interesting conversation about how that fits into sort of regular circumstances. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm interested in that conversation about, I mean, I think people around this table understand that well, and you know, our next step in this strategic direction is to have an entire population, a community, understand that with us.
I'm going to ask myself my own follow-up question. Perhaps maybe this would be a useful presentation at a BCSDA event. You know, with regards to your saying that this is a conversation that we could perhaps enhance. I mean, I do think you're right, we put in a lot of effort to understand from our perspective. I think there's value in taking that conversation to a provincial level, whether it's through a workshop, or if it's through a conversation like at this kind of opportunity as a foundational piece in understanding the work we give in education. It feels very groundbreaking. Trustee Berzovitz.
Thank you. You actually said one of the things I was going to say, but really I was just going to comment that I'm certainly looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this meeting after you attend it. At this point, I don't think it's fair to, I mean, we have a lot of questions that we probably can't answer until the process until you get that information tomorrow at that meeting. So I just don't want you to feel like we're putting you on the spot with a lot of stuff right now.
No, I appreciate that. I'll add that Director of Instruction, Ted Cadwallader, who was working in the ministry when this original framework for enhancing student learning was developed, is coming with me tomorrow, so he'll be a handy resource as we go through this. So I don't know, Ted, if you had anything to comment on about the direction or anything you're hearing from your friends in the ministry?
No, it's an ongoing tension, right, between the ministry's desire to be able to report in an accountability framework type of way, with the recognition that if there's going to be improved results across the province, then there needs to be some flexibility at the local level to decide what's important, and that having driven by the community. So that's what we're seeing with the framework, is they let go of the accountability and compliance nature of the previous framework, recognizing that there were reports flying out of districts that nobody read at the ministry and didn't help change and didn't support students. And so we're now on this path around the framework for enhancing student learning for good reasons.
Thank you. Trustee McKay?
Thank you. Through the chair to the superintendent and director of instruction, I can't help but wonder, this is rhetorical, you can think about it, but when we talk about includes evidence-based strategies for improvements that are measurable and outcome focused, and then layering in CISS, I'm curious what you know already about where we've been in the last 2 years and what evidence we have that has made a difference for our students. Because I don't know that it has to be evidence-based from other places. Perhaps it's our own evidence-based information that we know inherently here. I don't know, just a thought.
Can I speak to that?
I like the term evidence in there because it provides a broad spectrum of things that we can use to tell our story that's not just reliant on student performance data, which is what the previous accountability framework looked at.
Thank you. Trustee Brusich?
Thank you, and I'll follow up that with, I guess for me, one of the things I would hope to hear back from you, Mr. Sabo, through the chair, is after getting this initial input from them, any areas where the board might be able to do some advocacy work in any of this area. Because that, to me, is I think where I see a role more than, there's the operational pieces that this is going to entail, but there's also possibly some advocacy around what's effective, what's going to support the work of staff, supporting students.
Appreciate that.
Trustee Higginson?
So I'm also curious with this funny tension between the ministry and boards about what happens. So this is weird in my books. This is totally weird because you work for us. And here you are going to the ministry with our strategic plan to have them tell you whether they like it, sort of, or not. I mean, I don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. You'll let us know. We're all guessing. To come back to tell us, it's like this game of broken telephone. It's bizarre. So, without affecting your place there, I think it's important to assert that you actually work for us and we're not there.
Sure, no one's watching this.
So, if there's going to be a plan about strategic plans, it should involve these folks. So anyway, another message. I think it's an incredibly awkward position that they're putting you in. It's very awkward for you to have to go and then come back and tell us things that we're supposed to be doing with our strategic plan. So it's awkward. And in a moment of full disclosure, I happen to be on the Provincial Advisory Committee as well, so everything we say around here will probably end up there if you want it to or not. So. But it's awkward.
I agree.
Share what you just said. Yeah, actually, it's awkward.
Send a video.
Dale, you hear that? Trustee Pearson?
Actually, through the chair, Trustee Higginson, if you could share that at that committee, I would greatly appreciate it.
Yes.
In a more maybe in a diplomatic sort of way.
Yes, or not. I don't know. That's a board decision, but I think that this is an awkward position that you're being put in tomorrow, so we'll see.
We also have, I think trustee Higginson spoke to it earlier, the board chairs meeting is focused around strategic planning, so I think that discussion there'll be overlap there, I believe as well. So, might be easier for me to say it than you.
Waive the MOU. Any further questions? Seeing none. Okay. Good luck. Okay, there's no correspondence that I understand from the regular board meeting. I believe we have no unfinished business. Is there any new business that I am not aware of? No, I'm wondering if we have any questions. Alrighty, I will seek a motion to adjourn. So moved by trustee O'Neill, seconded by trustee Barron. All in favor? We're adjourned.